Michael Several, an interviewer for the Oral History Project of the Berkeley Historical Society. Today, March 30, 2022, I am in Berkeley with Norma Solarz, who is in Grass Valley, conducting this oral history on Zoom. Good afternoon, Norma.
Good afternoon, Michael.
We were told that Yiddish was your first language. What were your childhood circumstances that resulted in you learning Yiddish as your first language?
My childhood circumstances were that I was not born in the United States. So I was born in Europe, and my parents spoke Yiddish at home. So naturally, they spoke Yiddish with the children. And I was born after the war. So my first language was Yiddish, but we immigrated to the United States when I was about 3 years old. And we did try to integrate into the culture and language as soon as possible. So for me as a 3-year-old, I absorbed English pretty quickly, and it became very native for me. But Yiddish is, I like to use the expression hardwired in my brain. It's very, very native to me. When I hear Yiddish and speak Yiddish, it feels, if anything, as fluent as my English. It's not something I think about. It's just completely natural language for me. But my parents did pretty much switch over to English throughout, within about 5 years of being in the United States. And then Yiddish would only be spoken when we were around European friends or the little bit of family that had also survived the war and come over to the United States.
When you were in Europe, before you were 3, were you interacting with other Yiddish speakers in Europe?
I think not. I think that by the time I was born, my parents were already in Sweden. So there was a large Jewish community that immigrated to Sweden after the war, but from what little family history I have, we were mostly surrounded by other Swedes and not so many other Jews. So I believe that I spoke Swedish as well when I was a child, but that is not something that's continued. I only know a few words, and I understand they're not the nice words.
When you came to the United States, where did you first move to, or where did your family first settle?
So we came to the United States on the U.S. United States. It was actually a famous ship at the time because it's the fastest transatlantic ship that has ever been built. And I remember that we arrived in New York City, and I believe these are actually my own memories, even though I was so young. We were originally housed, according to my brother telling me this, by a HIAS, which is the organization that helped families immigrate and find other members of their families who were separated. So we were housed, I think, for a couple of months in some type of, I'm not sure where, I was too little. But we then moved into an apartment in the Bronx in New York City, and that I have very clear memories of. And clear memories of starting kindergarten in the Bronx and living within walking distance of the Yankee Stadium. It's also a very prominent memory. But also playing with the children on the street that we lived on, Ogden Avenue in the Bronx. And then my father found work, and my mother was home with 3 children. And I do have memories of that. We did move from the Bronx to Brooklyn when I was about 6 years old, and I have started first grade in Brooklyn, and lived in Brooklyn till until I moved to Manhattan, which was a big move when I was at that point 17. And going to City College of New York. So,
when you lived in the Bronx, were you surrounded by other Yiddish speakers, or was it?
No,
Yeah.
I remember that I remember speaking English.
Yeah.
I think my world was this way. When I was inside the home, I spoke Yiddish. When I was outside playing with the children, I spoke English outside, Yiddish inside.
Yeah.
And for a child, it was no problem. It didn't mean anything to me whether I was speaking English or Yiddish. I just adapted to whom I was speaking with. And I remember having playmates in the Bronx with whom I spoke English. And I think that the reason that my memories of the Bronx are so strong, in part, is that my sister, my older sister, I'm the youngest, was died in a car accident when I was 5 years old. And that was a big influence on my life. And it was just yet another tragedy in my parents' lives. They had gone through so much. And I have memories of that event when I was 5 years old, and how my parents reacted to it, and talking to the other children in the neighborhood in English. So those are my memories, not memories that you retain because you hear someone tell you a story.
Did you have other family in the United States, in Brooklyn, the Bronx at the time, cousins?
Yes, we did have other family. I have my mother's brother escaped with my mother and my father from Lodz. This was right after Hitler invaded, but people could still get out. So my uncle survived the war, and he and his wife came to the US and settled in the Bronx also. And my father had a sister who survived the war. I don't know as much about their war history or how they survived. And she and her husband came to the US and settled in San Francisco. So we definitely had some blood family in the US. We didn't see the people who lived in San Francisco, obviously, very often. But we did see my uncle, and I had 2 cousins, their 2 daughters. So that is part of my memory. And then once we moved to the Bronx, we did have other friends, my parents' friends, who were also immigrants. So my household was definitely, it was typical more of an immigrant family where English wasn't necessarily spoken, and where everybody was trying to go through the paces of becoming an American and learning how to take public transportation, or learn to drive, or learn to speak, or get a job, or find a doctor. All of the things that are so normal for a family were things my family and my parents' friends had to learn how to do in a new country. And that experience has definitely impacted me throughout my life, and probably formed the reason behind my becoming a dentist who worked in a public health setting, in a community health center, where I worked primarily with non-English speaking people. I felt very at home with that.
Oh, what could you briefly trace the journey of your parents to the United States,
Yeah.
from Loge to
Yes,
Brooklyn?
and before I do that, I want to mention that actually just 1 week ago, I found out about a book that was published last year. The name is Survival on the Margins by Ileana Adler. She, through Harvard University Press, I just got a copy of it this week, where she talks about the Polish Jewish refugees who escaped east from Poland into the Soviet Union. And that's how they survived the war. This is actually the story of my parents that I don't know that much about, and hope to learn more by reading this book. So my parents, my mother lived in Lodz, and my father lived just outside of Lodz in a little town called Khmelnyk, Poland, but I guess close enough where they socialized. And my mother was in a family of 4, so there were 3 sisters and a brother. And my grandmother was the second wife to my grandfather. The grandfather apparently died of some illness, I don't know what, when my mother was probably about 15 or so. And then my uncle, my mother's brother, had to support the family. My father came from a somewhat wealthier family. And so he helped my parents. He helped my mother and her family quite a bit. And when the war broke out, so September 1939, I think all of the Jews in Europe were asking the question, what should we do? And certainly the question in Poland, just as Hitler was invading, was where can we go? Do we stay or do we go? Because my mother was only about 17 and my father about 18, they had no children. They weren't married yet, whereas the other siblings were married and had children, and they didn't want to go. My parents decided, along with my mother's younger brother, that they would go to the east. Meanwhile, the Russians are coming into Poland from the east, the Germans from the west, and my aunt, my mother's sister, who I never knew, apparently was blonde and blue-eyed. So she didn't look Jewish, and she was able to get tickets at the train station. And my parents, meaning my mother, my father, and my uncle, went on the train to what was the new border, whatever the Russians and the Germans determined to be there, how they split up Poland. And there were thousands of people congregated at this new agreed upon German-Russian border. They were there for quite a long time in a very chaotic situation because they had to figure out of the soldiers which were the Germans and which were the Russians. And sometimes the Russians themselves didn't always know what side of the quote line was. But what happened after quite a number of weeks where they were camped in chaos at the border is the Russians basically deported. They took most of the people who were camped there, put them on trains, and took them into the interior of Russia, going to various places. I believe that my parents and uncle went to an area in the Ural Mountains. They always referred to it as Siberia. Mm. Whether it was actually Siberia or someplace in the Urals, I don't really know. But they were taken to work camps there. And while those conditions were extremely harsh and there was very little food, that's how they survived. If they had stayed in Lodz, their fate would have been the same as what happened with all their family that stayed. Yeah. They all went to a concentration camp and all but one perished. Mm-hmm. So they were in Russia during the war, and then my brother was born at the height of the war. So he was born in January 1942. He lives in Berkeley now. My mother has said through her life that the greatest thing that she was able to accomplish in her life was keeping her son alive during the war. That was not easy. After the war, pretty much, people were able to leave Russia. And my parents went back to Poland. And that's what most of the Polish refugees who had gone east did. They went back to wherever they came from, whatever country, and to discover that there was really nobody there. There was hardly anyone there. And then most of the Polish Jewish refugees who had gone east ended up in the DP camps. So lots of children were born there. I was born after that, after my parents had been in a DP camp in Germany. A lot of the German military camps were converted into DP camps that were run by Americans. And I don't know exactly how long they were in Germany, perhaps up to a couple of years. I think my sister was born just before they got to the DP camp, because she was born in 45, and I don't know if they were there yet. And I think that they, let's see, we came to the US in 1953, and they had been in Sweden about 7 years. So I don't know if that was a brief version, but no, the briefest I could do.
No, it was very interesting. So they went, they were in the DP camp for a relatively short time, a year or so, and then.
Right. And then they were able to leave for Sweden. And what my dad, I guess, was able to find out, because families were kind of coming back together, separated families. And we discovered that there was a surviving sister of my father who had been taken to Sweden to recuperate. They took in quite a few liberated survivors from the concentration camps. So I think that's the reason my parents relocated to Sweden, because there was this one surviving sister of my father's there. She remained in Sweden, and I actually did get to meet her when she came to the US several times to visit my parents.
So how did your parents and family get to the United States? Were they sponsored or?
I don't believe so. I believe the way they got here was through all of the channels. There was a quota system for coming to the United States at that time. They let so many Jews in from here and so many from there, and they waited the number of years that they had to wait, and then got permission to come.
What did your parents do when they lived in Sweden? Were they?
I believe that my father became a knitting machine operator.
Mm.
Sweden apparently had a very big industry in making sweaters. And I think my father learned to operate. They were very large machines. When I was a kid, he would sometimes take me to work with him. The machines were almost to the ceiling in the factory, and they were machines that would have the yarn on spools, multiple spools around the machine, and thousands of needles that would knit the yardage to make knitted sweaters. So my father was a factory worker. He operated that machine. And my mother was a sewing machine operator. She did the sewing of the sweaters.
Mm.
So in Brooklyn, there used to be 600 knitting mills, they called them. And this is before globalization, when these factories went basically to Asian countries where it costs less to manufacture our clothes, and our clothes, instead of being manufactured in the US, were manufactured elsewhere. So both my parents were factory workers.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that they were involved in the clothing industry, because Lodz was a textile center.
Yeah, but I don't think that they were involved with that there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So let's see. Maybe this might be a good place to show some pictures of some of the people that you talked about.
Okay, I'll share these pictures. This is my mother and father, and this is in Lodz. So my mom, I think, is about 16 in this picture, and my father is just a year older. And one of the things that's notable about them is that they're wearing these special shirts. I think that these are shirts that were associated with what was called the Bund. And the Bund was a political organization that a lot of Jewish people were involved with sort of socialist leanings. So I think this clothing was associated with being a member of the Bund. The next photo is a picture of my grandmother, who I'm named for. So this is also in Poland, and you can see that they had a well. There was no running water. So my mother's mother, and I have no photos whatsoever of my father's parents. And I don't know when this was taken, but it was before the war. This next photo is one of my mother's sisters, and also before the war and somewhere in Poland. And there's one other picture of the other sister. This is the blonde, blue-eyed sister who got the tickets for them to escape.
But she did not escape.
No, neither sister nor my grandmother survived. This next picture is going to be after the war. Okay. So there's my mom, and this is my brother. My brother was born in January 1942. And this is my sister, who was born in July of 1945. I believe this is in the DP camp in Germany, but I don't know exactly where it is. And yes.
What was your brother's name and your sister's name and your mother's name?
So my brother is Misha. My mother's European name was Frania. Her American name is Frances, and Misha went from Misha to Michael. And my sister was Helen. and Helen here in the US.
Okay.
And my mother looks so happy in this picture. So another picture, this is my family. So that's me at age 10. My father's is Noach. In America, he was Nathan. And here's my mom, Frances, Franya, and my brother, Michael. And my sister is gone at this point because I'm 10 and my sister died when she was 5, when I was 5. And this picture is taken in Sweden. So that's me probably about 6 months, maybe. And you can really see the difference in my mom's clothing, how these are the really good times. I came along when all was well. And the last photo that I'll show you is this one. And that is my mom, and my mom, Frances, and my daughter, Robin. Robin in this picture is age 5, and she's now 35. Okay, so those are my photos.
What is your family's connections to being a Jew, a Jewish identity?
So it's really interesting. When I was quite young, we celebrated all of the holidays and went to temple. And as I got older, there was really a shift in both my parents, a shift away from the religion. And while I am very culturally identified, and of course my parents' experience has really shaped my life, I would say, and my viewpoints, I'm not religious, but I am definitely steeped in feeling Jewish now, less as I was growing up as a teenager and going through a bit of a rebellious phase and wanting to be not so close with my parents, which is also how I came to be in Berkeley. But in the last few years, there's really been a renaissance for me, where I've really reconnected with the Yiddish language and more so the culture. I'm still not what I would call religious, but I'm definitely very identified. And if you ask me how I identify, I would definitely say Jewish. I lost my dad when he was pretty young. I was 30 and he passed away when he was just 64. So my connection to Yiddish is a way for me, it's like a conduit for me to stay connected with my family and my parents. I was very close with my mom. And when my dad passed away in New York, which was sudden and unexpected, my brother and I, we were living in, I was living in Oakland at the time, my brother in Berkeley. We pretty much brought my mother to Berkeley, and that was in 1982. And I was very close with my mom. She passed away, it's already 12 years ago. So for me, speaking Yiddish with my brother, which I do all the time, is a way for me to feel connected with my parents. And of course, this is going to sound very funny, but sometimes I remember my father wanted me to learn to read Yiddish. And when I was older, a young teenager, I didn't want to learn English. I was an American then, and I was not interested, and I pushed it away. And now that I am really studying Yiddish and speaking it and learning the grammar and reading it, I feel a connection with my father. Of course, where do we point to our relatives? We believe they're in heaven, right? So it's a way for me to speak to my parents, and especially my father. It's very strong feeling for me. I have one anecdote I really want to tell, which is a little bit off topic. My daughter, grew up in the Bay Area, and she's a real Californian, and her dad is not Jewish. So she grew up in two worlds, a Christian world and also a Jewish world. And she identifies with both, but she was also very close with my mother, her grandmother. And she never met her grandfather because he was gone. My daughter ended up going to Harvard University. And when she graduated, of course, we went to her graduation, her dad and me and her grandmother on her father's side. I was divorced from her dad at that point. So we're watching this graduation going on. And there's, it's thousands of people are all crammed in together. And where everybody's standing up as their children are marching in to the graduation ceremony. And all of a sudden, as I'm standing up, I feel like a hand on my shoulder. And I thought, oh, somebody's trying to get me to move over or something. So I turn around and there's absolutely nobody behind me. There's nobody there to be putting a hand on my shoulder. So I continue watching. My daughter is like marching forward and I feel it again. And all of a sudden I had the sensation of all of my grandparents and my aunts and uncle from Poland, as though their souls were resting on my shoulder and they were trying to come look to see how their great-grandchild had survived and was graduating from Harvard. And this thought came into my head that they were there with me. It was very powerful.
Oh, yeah.
So there is a very strong connection, even though I've never met them.
It's very moving to hear. I feel tears in my eyes hearing it.
So
yeah,
survived.
yeah. So is your brother religious at all, or is he pretty much like you?
He's pretty much like me,
Yeah.
I would say. Though he grew up with more of the religion than I did, because my parents didn't let go of it until I was probably about 10. So, and he's 8 years older than I am. So he had more of it through his life.
Yeah. So, can you tell us about your schooling? After you came to the United States,
Yeah. So I remember going to kindergarten in the Bronx. And so all public schools, first in the Bronx and then in Brooklyn, which in those days, especially in New York, you could get just the most excellent public school education. So public school all the way through high school. And then I started my college at a public school as well, City College of New York, which was an excellent school, but only did about 2 years. And when I entered my rebellious phase, and I was quite young when I started college. I actually graduated from high school when I was 16 and started college that same summer. And 16 was kind of young to start college. So by the time I was 18, I was already um, looking around and trying to decide what my world would consist of. So now we're up into about 1968, and I decide I'm done with school. And I went and got a job as a waitress at a restaurant in Manhattan, moved out of my parents' house. And after a year of working as a waitress and getting some real world experience and learning about unions, I went back to school and decided that I needed, this was 1969. So that was another one of the sort of social, cultural, and political events that shaped me. It was the summer when, there was California Dreaming, and several of my friends and I just decided to leave New York and come to California. I transferred from City College of New York to UC Berkeley and arrived in Berkeley in June of 1969 and thought that I had dropped into heaven. It just looked like a Gan Eden, which is Yiddish for paradise, the Garden of Eden. It was such a wonderful experience because New York was so gritty and so full of people, and Berkeley at that time was just so lovely, and flowers blooming and people friendly. And if you were going to cross the street, the cars would stop for you to cross. Not quite so true anymore. So it was really quite a change for me. And that was the beginning of my California life. So that was my rebellious period.
So what did you graduate? What kind of degree, what subject did you graduate?
I went through some changes there.
Yeah.
I graduated ultimately with a degree in botany. So I have a degree in botany, but then I went on to study dentistry. So I went to UC San Francisco and became a dentist. And when I finished that training, I pretty much found instead of going into just private practice, I was able to get a job in a community health center in Oakland called La Clínica de la Raza. And my patients were Spanish speaking, all immigrants. And I was right at home.
What drew you to dentistry?
So this was part of my rebellion, I would say. I worked for a couple of years before making the decision to go into dentistry. It was when I came to Berkeley and transferred to UC Berkeley. I only stayed in school for a short time. I got caught up in a lot of the commotion that was going on in Berkeley. And I left school for a number of years and I worked. And what I discovered working was that as a woman, no matter how smart you were, whatever work you did, somebody else got the credit for it. And it was usually the man in the office. And the job that I had, I did, it wasn't like it was a very intellectual job or whatever, but I was able to rise in the ranks of just being a really lowly card punch operator, and then rise through this firm that was doing multiphasic health testing. And I became a claims adjuster for the Teamsters Union. They didn't have health insurance. Instead, they had this multiphasic testing. So I was working with them, paying their claims. And what I noticed is that whatever the work I did was my boss would get the credit for it. So it didn't take me very long to decide that that wasn't going to be my path. And I found that while there was medical care available even to the poorest people in some form, there was no dental care available whatsoever. So that was what set me on that path, that I wanted to be able to provide healthcare, and in this case, dental services, to people who couldn't otherwise afford it. And when I went into my training at UCSF, I was a real outlier because most people were going into the profession, into private practice. And when I said, no, I want to provide care for underprivileged people, they thought I was really strange. I think that the world has changed a little bit, and I don't think that that's considered not a good choice anymore. I think that a lot of people now have made that choice, but at the time it was unusual. And people thought of me as either not smart enough to have my own practice or whatever. But it was, my goal was to provide care for people who couldn't otherwise afford it. And this was a way for me to do it through a community health center.
Were there other women in the dentistry program?
Well, so the year I started, which was 1976, we had 12 women in our class of 108. So the year before, the class that started ahead of us had 7. So we were almost 100% increase. And then when I graduated, the numbers kept creeping up. Now women are about 55% of the classes. But when I was training, that was not the case, and it was not so easy to try to go through my training. Being either a woman or if you were someone of color was more difficult.
What drew you to serving the poor? Did the experience of your parents with
Absolutely.
the Holocaust?
Yeah. I could see as I was growing up how much they struggled with language and understanding how to navigate the system, and we did end up being comfortable later on, but we were poor. And I guess that had an impact on me.
To start shifting to Yiddish, your experience with the Mameloshn mamas, but what you spoke Yiddish, continued to speak Yiddish to your brother over the years, right?
Yeah.
Were there other occasions you had to speak Yiddish?
Just at family events. It ultimately got easier for my mother to speak in English, actually. So we mostly spoke to each other in English. But lots of Yiddish was mixed in, and my comprehension was always good. Though I stopped speaking, formally, probably sometime between the ages of 5 and 8. So my native Yiddish was that of a child. So I've still had to learn a lot, even though the cadence and the thought process is native. I started attending the JCC in Berkeley had a Yiddish group. And my mother was a member of the JCC for many years. She attended the Yiddish chorus that was out of the JCC, and I think she was in a Yiddish speaking group. And then she did pass away. And many years later, I joined that same group. It met once a week, and we would have some conversation as best we could and try to read some transliterated works. So they'd be written with English letters, but they were the Yiddish words. And I started with that group, I think, in 2018. This was sort of the jumping off point for me, was by going to the JCC and meeting all of the other people who attended that group. Several of whom were elders in their 90s and spoke Yiddish, and a couple had been survivors of the war, and then lots of younger people as well. In 2019, after having been in the JCC group for about a year, I attended what's called Yiddish school at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst. If you're familiar with the Yiddish Book Center. So they have a week-long program for adults. They have lots of programs, but this one is specifically for adults. And I flew out to there in 2019, and I signed up for their intermediate Yiddish week program because I had no idea where I fit, since I understood Yiddish, but I couldn't read it. And my grammar was pretty bad. So that first day of that week that I was at the Yiddish school, there were the whole group of us. I met another woman that's in the orientation afternoon, and she and I spoke Yiddish to each other. And it turned out she had been born in a DP camp, and her parents' story was similar. Though she was a little bit older than me, she had been born in the camp, and we spoke Yiddish to each other. And she said to me, well, which class are you going to be in? Are you in the advanced class with me? And I said, no, I signed up for intermediate. I knew I wasn't a beginner. And she said, no, you're not an intermediate. You're coming with me to advanced. So the next morning when the classes started, I went to the advanced class, which was entirely in Yiddish. It was an immersion class. There was no English whatsoever. And the class was, the teacher started speaking in Yiddish, and all of a sudden my brain went, ooh, and the words just came in like water. I understood everything he said. I could respond to him. Couldn't read a word that he had up on the board. And I spent the week there, and it was as though my head was on fire. It was such an amazing experience for me, because it was like I had uncovered repressed memories or something. It was really extraordinary. And I called up my family every night, and I said, I cannot believe this. I had no idea there was so much Yiddish inside my head. So when I came back to Berkeley, to my little Yiddish group at the JCC, I said, I need to learn to read. I can speak and I can comprehend, but I'm illiterate. This is no good. So this is actually the genesis of the Mameloshn Mamas, because one of our groups, Susan Cohen, who I had met, and she could read reasonably well at that point. I said, would you mind sitting with me and starting to teach me to read? And she did. She helped me. Just, I had to learn the alphabet. And then Dolores, who's also in our group, she said, well, we want to there's a couple of us that want to just do some reading outside of the JCC group. So then there was Susan and myself and Dolores, and then there was Sharon, and then Millie and Judy said, well, we want to do this too. So we just said, okay, let's get together. And then we would meet at each other's houses. This is just, before the pandemic. And we would, come up with a list of things to read. We were reading things like Isaac Bashevis Singer. He gave a speech when he accepted the Nobel Prize, and he gave it in Yiddish. So we had that, and we were try our best to read along with that. And then we came up with a little story here and a little story there. And we just met once a week. And then we had the pandemic and we were stuck. So we started, like everybody else, Zoom. And that turned out to be a real lifesaver for me, because my husband and I moved out of the Bay Area, and I didn't know how we were going to continue. But with Zoom, everybody was on Zoom. It didn't matter if it was your neighbor next door. So we just got into this groove, and we found things to read. We read Shalom Aleicham's Matel, then Kassan's. We read volume 1 together, and we really got connected. We really came from different reasons and different backgrounds, but we just really bonded. And we've been doing this very consistently once a week since, I'm going to say, since about maybe April 2019 or something like that, May. So it's about 3 years.
Wow.
And I mean, it in the beginning, it wasn't quite so regular, but now it's clockwork. And we've gone through several volumes. We're reading Sheva Zucker's volume that she just published of poetry of various Yiddish poets. And some of us, Sharon and Susan and I, take classes separately. So it's quite serious. The name, somewhere in there, it was actually my idea. I thought we needed a name. We were so regular. So I sent around a list of various silly names, but Mameloshn Mamas is the one that stuck. And that's who we are. And it's just been this, there was a 7th person who came intermittently, but she really hasn't come for a long time. And we haven't really looked for other people. We're like a little bonded family. So far, we haven't really invited anybody else.
I think at one point you mentioned that you felt that your ability to speak Yiddish was that of a child, but it sounded like that what happened at the Yiddish Book Center made you realize that your knowledge, your ability to speak was much greater than that.
Yes, it was. The ability to comprehend was really great. My grammar was really terrible, which is not that surprising if you. So that's what I've been studying. The grammar's really been a bit of a bear to learn, but I definitely speak better, and now I can read, which I couldn't before. So it's been a real labor of love, and I couldn't have done it without the other people in our group. I mean, you take classes, but it's it being regular and really having that social connection with the other women. When we meet once a week, we chat first before we read. So we'll have about a half an hour of conversation, and we talk about everything. We talk about, and it's in Yiddish. I'm going to say 90%. And politics and family things and opinions and writers, and it's really wonderful conversation. And then we dig into our work, our reading.
Yeah.
And
so if I understand the history, there was the Yiddish conversation group at the JCC, and your group kind of is a split off from that.
Right.
And that, as I understand it, that conversation group is no longer functioning.
Well, because of the pandemic, because we met in person, it just came to a halt.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's reconvened or not.
Yeah.
I hope it does. But
so when you the Mameloshn mamas split off, that conversation group was still functioning with.
Oh, we didn't split off from the sense that we stopped going to the JCC. We did both. So before the pandemic, we would go every week to the whole JCC group. Yeah. And then we would be there. And then we separately had additionally a meeting for our little split off group. So we expanded what we were doing. We didn't trade them.
Yeah. So how many people before you started the Mameloshn?
At the JCC?
Yeah, about how many people were?
It ranged between, I'm going to say, it was probably about 8 to 12. Not everyone came every single week, and then there were people who came for a long time and then they couldn't come for some reason. But I would say it would average around 10 people. It wasn't a big group, but sometimes there were 12. But the beauty of it was that we had so many elders. We had people who were over 90 or in their late 80s, and they really added a richness, though we had to laugh a lot because they were almost universally hard of hearing. So there was a lot of repetition. But it was really a pleasure being able to connect with those elders, and especially for me, because I didn't have that generation in my life. So that's something that I wish I still had.
So now, since you're able to read some Hebrew, do you read, I mean, Yiddish, hold my tongue. Do you read outside of the group?
Right now, I'm taking a class in addition to our Mameloshn mamas. So I have homework from that. So I have plenty of reading. I think that once that class sort of is ongoing. A subset of the mamas are taking that. Sharon and Susan and I are in that class together, the weekly Yiddish class. So that we spend a lot of time on Yiddish. We have several hours of homework every week, and then we have an hour and a half of class. So between that and then meeting with the mamas, it's, I'm going to say it's over 5 hours of solid Yiddish a week.
What is the name of the or who is sponsoring that class you're taking?
It's given by a man named Noah Barrera. Noah Barrera is his English name. We call him Reb Noach. And he used to teach at a workers' circle. And he's now teaching, I think, also with Evo. And he does these private classes. And we take classes with him privately, which we have done for 2 years.
Mm. And the classes are on Zoom and
yes.
Yeah. There's a Yiddish conversation group in the Bay Area, Flisic. Have you participated in that?
Not so much. I attended one of their meetings, and the format of their meetings is not appealing to me compared to the format of our Mameloshn, mm-hmm. where we're reading. They have more of what they call a theme, where somebody brings a topic, and then you're supposed to, have a conversation on that topic. Mm-hmm. That's not my interest. I can speak Yiddish with my brother or my friends. I don't need to have that type of a setting. I want to learn and read the literature. I want to learn more about the Yiddish writers. I want to read what they wrote and think about it. So it's two different pathways. And I think that for the people who are in the Flisic salon, that's very enjoyable for them. But I found a path that was more suited to my needs.
Why do you think there is a revival of Yiddish?
I think that there is something about Yiddish that is magnetic, for me anyway. There is something about the thought process, the sarcasm, the in-depth thinking, the critical thinking that is very magnetic. And I think that that's part of the reason that it has survived. There's certainly this, for me, there's the side of staying connected with family. But for most Jews who have, who are part of the diaspora, which is pretty much all of us, you get assimilated and you lose that thread. But when I look around at the people who are studying Yiddish, it's not just Jews. It's people from all kinds of places. And especially now with Zoom. So I think that part of it is the accessibility and all of the hard work, the foundational work that people like Aaron Lansky have done to create a library of the literature that's free and accessible. I think it's all of the teachers who are so passionate about the language. And I'm going to say that the pandemic was, we're all at home going through our what's old in the closet, and we discover things about our families, and it piques our interest. I certainly have Jewish friends who have said to me, what are you doing? Why are you studying Yiddish? It's dead. Not dead to me.
Yeah. Well, having grown up not knowing Yiddish, one thing that appears to me is it's in a way, it's a very poetic language, and being able to express emotions and an attitude That seems so Jewish.
Right. And that, I think, is what my use of the word magnetic.
Mm,
I think that's what's magnetic about it. That it is, there's an emotional intelligence built into it. It's not just a language that you use to describe an engineering project. It's a language that really delves into your emotions.
mm. Are there other Bay Area Yiddish resources, classes, the theater? I believe there's a chorus, is there?
Yes, I actually belonged to the chorus for a couple of years. There is the chorus is going on. It's very strong right now. And but it's too difficult for me at this distance. And also I'm not much of a singer, though I did join and sing with the chorus for a while. And that is, actually I should have included that as being part of the incipient and nascent beginnings. It was hearing the Yiddish songs that brought me back to my family, because these were songs I heard when I was a child. So there are lots of resources available on Zoom. But as far as the Bay Area, there is something called Der Bai, which is it's a group that's put together by it's Fischl's Fischl's Yiddish group. I think you may have heard about that. They have a weekly Zoom, and it draws on people from all over the world. But I think it's primarily Bay Area, San Jose, and Peninsula. And they have guests once a week that come and talk about their lives or some topic, and that's done entirely in Yiddish. So you have to be a Yiddish speaker essentially to attend that, and that's once a week. And it's another way to incorporate Yiddish into your week, is to attend those programs. They are excellent. As far as, well, the JCC, of course, is another route. I think that the Avi Komen may have some programs. I think that's the store on Claremont Avenue.
Yeah.
But I don't know what they're doing now. And, since the pandemic and since I've moved out of the Bay Area, I'm not as up on what goes on in the Bay Area. I know that here where I live in Nevada County, which has a total population of under 100,000 people, I attend, I'm a member of the synagogue. There's one synagogue, and there's one, and Chabad also has a presence here. Nobody at my synagogue speaks Yiddish, and I'm kind of contemplating what I can do about that.
About Chabad, does anybody?
At Chabad they probably do speak Yiddish, but I don't attend that. I attend. It's B'nai Harim here in Grass Valley, and none of the members are Yiddish speakers.
Well, I want to thank you. I have no more questions. Perhaps Janine might have some follow-up questions. Janine?
Hi, I'm just reappearing here. Thank you very much. That was very interesting, Norma. I guess I did have just two questions, brief, hopefully. what did your parents' families, your parents, like their parents' families do in Łódź, in Poland? Do you know?
I don't know exactly. My father's side, I know a little bit more. They were a little bit wealthier, and I understood that my father's family had what was a paper bag manufacturing company. And I think what that meant is they would get the paper goods kind of in like big flats, and then they would fold them into paper bags and prepare those so that they could be used in the stores. And that was their business. They prepared these bags and then provided them. It's also one of the few stories I know. Apparently, I don't know if it was the dust from this paper that ended up causing a fire in their home. And I think that my father's mother may have perished in that fire. So that was my father's side. And I think that they made a reasonable living from that. My mother's side, my grandfather died when my mom was relatively young, and then the man of the family was her younger brother. He became a tailor, so he studied tailoring as an apprentice, and then he worked as a tailor, and that was how the family was able to survive, I guess, up until the war when he escaped. And that's also how he survived in the work camp in the Soviet Union. He did tailoring for the Russian military.
Thank you. And then you mentioned the Bund. That was socialist? Was it also primarily Jewish?
I don't know that it was only Jewish. I know that there were a lot of Jews that were involved in it. And I don't know how active my parents were in it. I know that once we came to this country, my father said, stay out of politics. I guess based on his own experiences. But apparently in that photo, they're wearing they're kind of like Russian shirts. And I think the Bund was definitely associated with sort of communist and socialist philosophy.
Yeah.
I have a kind of a follow-up question. Did your parents ever express any strong Zionist feelings or desire to move to Israel or whatever?
Well, they certainly knew people who, instead of coming to the US, went to Israel.
Yeah.
They were very pro-Israel, but not to the point where they themselves wanted to go move there. So we definitely had, I don't know if we had family, but we had friends. They had friends who had gone to Israel, and we were always a very pro-Israel family. But I don't know if that's the same as being Zionist.
I want to thank you again, and we will look forward to following up with the Mameloshn mamas together as a group.